The free man they tried to enslave, a witness's fight for justice in 1847 America. The testimony that changed everything. The courthouse in Jefferson County, Missouri smelled of old wood and newer fear. It was March 1847, and outside the windows, spring rain drummed against glass like fingers demanding entry. Inside, 73 people sat in silence so complete you could hear the oil lamps hissing on their chains. My name is Marcus Webb, and I'm telling you this story because somebody needs to remember what happened when one man's testimony threatened to tear apart everything the powerful had built. Before we begin this journey into the past, I want to welcome you to the Chronicle Vault. If you appreciate stories of courage against impossible odds, please like and subscribe. Now, let's step back into a moment when truth became the most dangerous weapon a man could carry. James Caldwell stood in the witness box, his dark hands gripping the rail so hard his knuckles had gone pale. He was a free man, had the papers to prove it, carried them in his coat pocket every single day because in Missouri in 1847, being free wasn't enough. You had to prove it, constantly, to any white man who demanded to see your freedom written down and signed. But today, his freedom papers wouldn't help him. Today, he was testifying against 3 white men accused of murdering a family of freed slaves on the outskirts of town. Today, he was the only witness to what had happened in the Morrison cabin on a cold February night when screams had echoed through the woods and blood had painted the snow. "State your name for the record," Judge Cornelius Blackwell said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years on the bench. "James Caldwell, Your Honor. Free man of color, residing at the Caldwell farm, 5 miles north of Jefferson." The 3 accused men sat at the defense table, their faces carved from stone. Luther Vance owned half the farmland in the county. His son, Thomas, sat beside him, barely 20 years old with eyes that had learned cruelty early. The third man, Silas Cord, was their foreman, a man known for solving problems that needed solving when the law looked the other way. "Mr. Caldwell," the prosecutor began, a thin man named Albert Chase who'd taken this case when nobody else would, "tell the court what you saw on the night of February 14th. James took a breath that seemed to pull all the air from the room. Every eye was on him. Some with hope, most with hatred, all with the certain knowledge that what he said next would matter. "I was checking my trapline in the woods near Morrison Creek," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It was near midnight. Cold. Clear. The moon was full, bright enough to see your shadow on the snow. And what drew your attention to the Morrison cabin?" "I heard shouting. Then a woman screaming. I moved closer, staying in the tree line, because..." He paused, choosing his words carefully, "because I knew the Morrisons had been having trouble. People didn't like that they'd bought their freedom, bought their own land. Didn't like them being independent." Luther Vance shifted in his chair, a movement so slight most people missed it. But James saw. He'd learned to watch powerful men for the small tells that preceded violence. "Continue, Mr. Caldwell." "I saw 3 men on horseback outside the cabin. The door was open. Inside, I could see Solomon Morrison on the floor. His wife, Ruth, was backing away from one of the men. Their 2 children, they were." His voice cracked, just slightly, "they were crying in the corner." The courtroom remained silent, but it was a different silence now. Heavier. Subscribe for more historical stories, like and comment to share your thoughts, and hit the bell icon for frontier and slavery-era story updates. Don't miss out on this unforgettable journey through history's struggles, courage, and the enduring fight for justice. Can you identify the 3 men you saw that night? This was the moment. This was where James Caldwell either condemned himself to death or let murderers walk free. There was no middle ground, no safe answer, no way to speak truth without consequences. "Luther Vance," James said, pointing. "Thomas Vance. And Silas Cord." The courthouse erupted. Shouts of outrage from the Vance family's allies. Gasps from those who'd hoped for justice but never expected it to come this far. Judge Blackwell's gavel cracked like thunder, demanding order. "One more outburst and I'll clear this courtroom," Blackwell warned. The defense attorney, a sharp-faced man named Whitmore, stood slowly. He was smiling, and that smile was the most terrifying thing in the room. "Mr. Caldwell," Whitmore began, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "it was midnight, you said. And you were how far from the cabin?" "Maybe 40 yards, in the tree line." 40 yards. At midnight. And yet you claim to have clearly seen 3 men you could identify. The moon was full. The snow reflected the light. I could see clear as day. Clear as day, Whitmore repeated, letting the phrase hang. "Mr. Caldwell, how long have you known my clients?" "I don't know them personally." "I know of them." "You know of them. You know they're prominent men in this county. You know they have influence, wealth, standing in the community." "I know what I saw." "Or perhaps," Whitmore's voice sharpened, "you know what certain people wanted you to say. Tell me, Mr. Caldwell, who approached you about testifying today?" James's jaw tightened. "Nobody approached me. I came forward because 3 people are dead and 2 children are orphaned." "How noble. And yet I find it curious that a free Negro would risk so much to testify against white men of standing, unless someone promised you something. Money, perhaps. Land. Protection. Nobody promised me nothing but a chance to tell the truth." "The truth," Whitmore smiled wider. "Let's discuss truth, Mr. Caldwell. Isn't it true that you were denied a loan last year to expand your farm? And isn't it true that loan was denied by Luther Vance's bank?" The trap was springing. James could feel it closing around him. "That has nothing to do with what I saw. Doesn't it? Sounds like motive to me. Motive to lie. Motive to destroy a man's reputation because he made a sound business decision you didn't like." "I saw what I saw." "You saw what you wanted to see. You saw an opportunity for revenge dressed up as justice." Prosecutor Chase objected, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and in a courtroom in Missouri in 1847, doubt was all the defense needed when a black man testified against white men. The day wore on. James held firm despite Whitmore's attacks, despite the hostile stares from half the courtroom, despite the sick certainty growing in his stomach that truth might not be enough. When court adjourned for the day, Judge Blackwell gavelled the session closed with a warning. "This trial will reconvene tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Mr. Caldwell, you are reminded that you remain under oath and under the court's protection. Anyone who interferes with this witness will answer to me personally." But protection ended at the courthouse door. James walked out into the rainy evening, coat pulled tight against the cold. The streets of Jefferson were emptier than usual. People who might have greeted him now looked away. People who'd bought vegetables from his farm now crossed the street to avoid him. He'd made it 2 blocks when he heard footsteps behind him. Fast. Purposeful. James didn't run. Running would confirm guilt in their minds, would give them excuse for what they wanted to do anyway. Instead, he turned to face them. 3 men emerged from an alley. Not the Vances or Cord, they were too smart to dirty their own hands. These were hired muscle, men whose faces James didn't recognize, which somehow made it worse. "You made a mistake today," the lead man said. He was thick-set, with a beard that hadn't seen a razor in weeks. "Testifying against your betters. Lying under oath." "I didn't lie. Judge seems to think maybe you did. Whole town thinks you did. Question is, what are we going to do about it?" James's hand moved toward his coat pocket where he kept a small knife. "Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing." The second man laughed. "He's reaching for something. Probably a weapon. We'd be justified in defending ourselves, wouldn't we?" This was how it would happen. An attack in a dark street, James killed while resisting, his testimony discredited, the trial ending in acquittal. Clean. Simple. The way powerful men had been silencing witnesses for centuries. But before anyone could move, a voice cut through the rain. Step away from him. All four men turned. A woman stood at the mouth of the alley, small and fierce, holding a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. Sarah Brennan, widow of a Union sympathizer who died fighting for abolition in Kansas. She ran a boarding house for freed slaves and had made enemies of half the county doing it. "This ain't your concern, Mrs. Brennan," the bearded man said. "I'm making it my concern. Mr. Caldwell is a guest at my establishment. Anyone who touches him answers to me, and I don't miss at this distance." The three men looked at each other, calculating. One woman with one pistol against three men should have been easy odds. But Sarah Brennan had a reputation for meaning what she said, and the alley was too narrow for them to spread out. "This isn't over," the bearded man finally said, backing away. "Not by half." They disappeared into the rain, and James released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Sarah replied, lowering the pistol. "You just became the most dangerous man in Jefferson County. They won't stop until they silence you or discredit you completely. Then what do I do? You survive tonight. Tomorrow you go back to that courthouse and you tell the truth again. And you keep telling it until either they believe you or they kill you for it. Those aren't great options. They're the only options truth-tellers ever get." They walked together through the rain toward Sarah's boarding house, while somewhere in the darkness, powerful men gathered to discuss how to make a witness disappear. When allies become targets. The price of standing firm. The boarding house sat on the edge of Jefferson's respectable district, right where propriety ended and poverty began. Sarah Brennan had inherited it from her husband along with his debts and his enemies. She'd paid off the former and collected more of the latter by turning the house into a refuge for freed slaves, runaways, and anyone else the town's powerful families wanted to pretend didn't exist. James had a small room on the second floor, barely large enough for a bed and a chair, but it was his and he paid rent same as anyone. Tonight, though, the room felt like a trap. One door, one window, and 3 floors between him and the street if things went wrong. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat in the dark, listening to the rain and thinking about Solomon Morrison. They'd known each other, not well, but enough to nod when they passed on the road. Solomon had bought his family's freedom after 15 years of saving every penny, working extra jobs, making himself indispensable to his former master until the man agreed to a price. Then Solomon had done something unforgivable in the eyes of men like Luther Vance. He'd bought land. 40 acres of good bottom land near the creek, perfect for farming. He'd paid full price, in cash, with witnesses to the sale. Legal. Proper. Impossible to challenge in court. But there were other ways to challenge things. James had heard the rumors in the weeks before the murders. Solomon was getting too big for his station. Someone needed to remind him of his place. The warnings had been subtle at first, then less so. Crops trampled. Livestock found dead. Finally, on that February night, 3 men had decided to deliver a message that couldn't be ignored. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. James's hand went to the knife under his pillow. "It's Sarah," came the whispered voice. He opened the door to find the widow standing in the hallway, still dressed, clearly as sleepless as he was. "We need to talk," she said, slipping inside and closing the door. "I've been thinking about tomorrow." "What about it?" "They'll come at you harder. Whitmore will dig into every detail of your past, looking for ammunition. The Vances will have people in that courtroom making sure the jury knows what happens to communities that let Negroes testify against white men." "I know. Do you?" "Because I don't think you understand how far they'll go." She moved to the window, peering through the curtain at the dark street below. "I've seen this before, James. In Kansas. Men who stood up for what's right, thinking the law would protect them. The law only protects the powerful. Everyone else is on their own. Then why are you helping me? She turned back to him, and in the dim light from the hallway, her face looked older than her 40 years. Because someone has to. Because if people like us don't stand up, then the Luther Vances of the world win. They always win. And that's a world I don't want to live in. Even if it gets you killed. My husband died fighting for what he believed in. If I die doing the same, at least I'll have been worth something. The rain had stopped, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by distant dogs and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Sarah was about to say something else when they both heard it. Footsteps. Multiple people. Moving quietly but not quietly enough. James moved to the window. In the street below, 6 men were gathering. Some carried clubs. One had a rope coiled over his shoulder. They weren't hiding anymore, weren't pretending this was anything other than what it was. They're not waiting for tomorrow, James said quietly. Sarah's face went pale. The back stairs. Now. They moved fast but carefully, Sarah leading the way through the darkened boarding house. Other residents were stirring, awakened by some instinct that sensed danger even in sleep. An elderly man poked his head out of his room. What's happening? Stay inside. Lock your door. Don't open it for anyone, Sarah commanded. They'd made it halfway down the back stairs when the front door exploded inward. Not kicked, but hit with something heavy, a battering ram maybe, the sound echoing through the house like thunder. Caldwell, a voice shouted. We know you're in here. Come out peaceful and nobody else gets hurt. It was a lie, of course. They'd hurt everyone if it suited their purposes. That's what happened when law and order became tools of oppression rather than justice. Sarah and James reached the back door. It opened onto an alley that ran between boarding houses and warehouses. Freedom was 20 feet away. Then a shape stepped into the doorway. Silas Cord himself, no longer content to let hired thugs handle his business. He was holding a shotgun, and at this range, he couldn't miss. Going somewhere, Caldwell? Behind them, footsteps pounded down the stairs. Ahead, Cord's shotgun gleamed in the moonlight. They were trapped. But Sarah Brennan hadn't survived 3 years as a widow in hostile territory by accepting traps as final. She grabbed a lantern from the wall and threw it straight at Cord. He ducked instinctively, and in that moment of distraction, James rushed forward. He hit Cord low and hard, driving his shoulder into the man's stomach. The shotgun discharged, buckshot ripping into the ceiling. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, both fighting for control of the weapon. Run! James shouted to Sarah, but she was already moving, not away but toward the front of the house, screaming at the top of her lungs. Fire! Fire! The boarding house is on fire. It was a brilliant move. The one thing that terrified every resident of a wooden town more than violence was flame. Fire could consume entire city blocks in hours, killing the innocent along with the guilty. Within seconds, windows were opening all along the street. People were shouting. Bells began to ring. The mob that had broken into the boarding house suddenly found themselves exposed. What had been a quiet lynching was now a public spectacle with witnesses gathering and the volunteer fire brigade already mobilizing. James and Cord were still fighting over the shotgun. Cord was bigger, stronger, but James fought with the desperation of a man who knew this was his only chance. He got a hand on the barrel, wrenched it sideways, and brought his knee up into Cord's ribs. The foreman grunted, his grip loosening just enough. James tore the shotgun away and scrambled to his feet, backing toward the street where light and witnesses meant relative safety. Cord stood slowly, his face twisted with rage. You just signed your death warrant, boy. Maybe, James replied, the shotgun steady in his hands. But I'll die a free man who told the truth. What will you die as? The street was filling with people now. The mob from the boarding house was melting away, unwilling to be identified. Cord stared at James for a long moment, calculation visible in his eyes. Then he turned and walked into the darkness, leaving James standing in the alley with a smoking shotgun and the certain knowledge that this was far from over. Judge Blackwell arrived 20 minutes later, roused from sleep by the commotion. He took one look at the broken door, the scattered mob, and James standing with Cord's shotgun, and his face hardened into granite. "This ends now," he said, his voice carrying authority even in his nightshirt. "James Caldwell is under the court's official protection as of this moment. Anyone who touches him will be held in contempt and jailed. Sheriff Morgan, I want a deputy on this boarding house until the trial concludes." Sheriff Morgan, a tired-looking man in his 50s, nodded reluctantly. He was Luther Vance's cousin by marriage, and everyone knew where his loyalties lay, but even he couldn't openly defy a direct order from the judge. "The trial reconvenes at 9 o'clock, Blackwell continued. "Mr. Caldwell, I suggest you get what rest you can. Tomorrow will be difficult." As the crowd dispersed and the crisis faded, Sarah found James sitting on the boarding house steps, still holding the shotgun. "You all right?" she asked. "No. But I will be. They're going to kill you, you know. If not tonight, then tomorrow, or the day after. Luther Vance doesn't lose, and he especially doesn't lose to people like us." "People like us?" "People who believe truth matters more than power." James looked up at the stars, visible now that the rain had cleared. "My father was born a slave. He told me once that freedom isn't something given. It's something taken, piece by piece, truth by truth. If I don't testify tomorrow, if I let them scare me into silence, then I'm a slave again. Maybe not in chains, but in fear. And that's worse." Sarah sat down beside him. "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. He also died young, killed by men who didn't like his wisdom. They sat in silence for a while, two people on the wrong side of power, waiting for the sun to rise on a day that would determine whether justice was real or just another lie the powerful told to keep the rest in line. Inside the boarding house, a dozen freed slaves and sympathizers tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow's verdict would affect all of them. If James's testimony held, if 3 white men were convicted of murdering freed blacks, it would set a precedent that terrified the slaveholding establishment. It would mean that black testimony had value, that black lives had worth, that the old order was crumbling. And powerful men would do anything to prevent that. The verdict that shook a county. When justice demands everything. The courthouse was packed by 8:30. People had camped outside overnight to secure seats, and the crowd had split into clear factions. On one side sat Luther Vance's allies, plantation owners, and businessmen who saw this trial as an existential threat to their way of life. On the other side, a smaller but determined group of abolitionists, freed slaves, and those rare souls who believed the law should apply equally to all. James Caldwell walked through that divided crowd with Deputy Marshal Thomas Wright beside him. Wright was one of 2 federal marshals assigned to the territory, and Judge Blackwell had called him in specifically to ensure James made it to the courthouse alive. The judge was done taking chances. "Quite a crowd," Wright observed, his hand resting on his pistol. He was young for a marshal, maybe 30, with the kind of quiet competence that came from seeing too much violence too early. "They all want to see how this ends," James replied. "How do you think it ends?" "Honestly? I don't know. But I'm going to tell the truth and let the chips fall." Inside, Judge Blackwell was already at his bench, his expression grave. The jury, 12 white men selected from the county's property owners, sat in their box looking uncomfortable. They knew the weight of what they'd been asked to decide. Prosecutor Chase stood as court was called to order. "Your Honor, the prosecution rests. We have one witness who saw the crime. His testimony is clear, consistent, and unshaken despite aggressive cross-examination. The defense has offered no alternative explanation for how 3 members of the Morrison family died that night. We ask that the jury consider the evidence and return a verdict of guilty. Defense attorney Whitmore rose slowly, his movements theatrical. Your Honor, the defense does have an alternative explanation. 3 respected members of this community have been falsely accused by a witness with clear motive to lie. Mr. Caldwell was denied a loan. He holds a grudge. He has fabricated this entire story to damage my client's reputations. And the Morrison family? Chase shot back. Are they fabricated too? Are their deaths just inconvenient facts? The Morrisons' deaths are tragic, Whitmore said smoothly. But tragedy doesn't equal truth. Without credible testimony, this case is nothing but speculation and prejudice. The judge held up his hand for silence. Gentlemen, save your closing arguments for the jury. Is there any additional testimony? Whitmore smiled. Actually, Your Honor, the defense calls Luther Vance to the stand. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. It was unusual for the accused to testify, risky even, but Vance clearly believed his word would outweigh James's. Luther Vance took the stand with the confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences. He was in his 50s, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mr. Vance, Whitmore began, where were you on the night of February 14th? At home with my family. We had dinner together, then retired to the sitting room. My wife was doing needlework. I was reading the newspaper. My son Thomas was there as well. We were home all evening. Can anyone corroborate this? My wife. My household staff. Several neighbors saw us through the windows as they passed. It was a simple alibi, probably coached, impossible to disprove without witnesses willing to call Luther Vance a liar to his face. In Jefferson County in 1847, there weren't many people willing to do that. Chase stood for cross-examination. Mr. Vance, you knew the Morrison family? I knew of them. You knew they'd recently purchased land near Morrison Creek? I'd heard that, yes. Did it bother you? A freed Negro family owning property in your county? Vance's eyes hardened. My personal feelings about the social order are irrelevant to this case. Are they? Because witnesses will testify that you publicly stated Solomon Morrison was getting above his station and needed to be reminded of his place. I don't recall saying that. You don't recall, or you didn't say it. I don't make a habit of discussing Negroes at all, Mr. Chase. It went on for an hour, Chase probing for weakness, Vance deflecting with the skill of a man who'd talked his way out of trouble before. Finally, the judge called for closing arguments. Chase stood before the jury, his voice steady. Gentlemen, you've heard testimony from an eyewitness who risked everything to tell you what he saw. James Caldwell had no reason to come forward except his conscience. He knew the danger. He knew the cost. And yet he testified because 3 people were murdered and someone needed to speak for them. He pointed to the Vances and Cord. These men want you to believe that a free Negro would fabricate a story so dangerous it might get him killed, all because of a denied loan. Does that make sense to you? Or does it make more sense that these 3 men, who've expressed open hostility to freed slaves owning property, decided to send a message that got out of hand? Whitmore's closing was equally passionate. This case hinges on the testimony of one man with clear motive to lie. James Caldwell is asking you to destroy the reputations of 3 respected citizens based on his word alone. His word against theirs. And in making that choice, you're deciding what kind of county we live in. One where accusations are enough. Where grudges can masquerade as justice. Or one where evidence and character matter. Judge Blackwell gave the jury their instructions. You must decide if the prosecution has proven beyond reasonable doubt that these 3 men committed the crimes charged. You cannot convict based on prejudice or sympathy. Only evidence. The jury filed out. The courtroom erupted into nervous conversation. James sat quietly, Sarah beside him, both of them waiting. 3 hours passed. Then 6. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening. Judge Blackwell called for updates twice, but the jury remained deadlocked. Finally, as darkness fell, the jury filed back in. Their faces told the story before anyone spoke. "Have you reached a verdict?" Blackwell asked. The foreman, a farmer named Henderson, stood. "We have, Your Honor. On all charges, we find the defendants not guilty." The courthouse exploded. Vance's supporters cheered. Abolitionists shouted in outrage. The judge's gavel cracked repeatedly, demanding order. James sat motionless, the verdict hitting him like a physical blow. He'd known it was possible, even likely, but hearing it spoken made it real. Sarah grabbed his arm. "We need to leave. Now." They pushed through the crowd toward the exit, but Luther Vance blocked their path. Up close, his smile was predatory. "No hard feelings, Caldwell," he said quietly. "You did what you thought was right. Course, doing what you think is right tends to have consequences. You might want to think about moving on. Finding somewhere else to farm. Is that a threat?" "It's friendly advice. This county isn't safe for people who make false accusations against respected citizens." Marshal Wright appeared at James's shoulder. "Mr. Vance, I suggest you step aside." Vance held his ground for a moment, then moved, still smiling. As James and Sarah pushed out into the night, they could hear celebrating behind them. They made it back to the boarding house to find it dark and quiet. Too quiet. "Something's wrong," Sarah whispered. She was right. The front door stood open. Inside, furniture had been overturned. On the wall, someone had painted a message in red, "Liars pay." Sarah's tenants were gone, fled in fear. The building that had been a refuge was now a target. "They're going to burn it," James said quietly. "Tonight or tomorrow. They're going to burn it and make sure I'm inside when they do. Then we leave. Right now. I have money saved. We can go north, to Illinois or Indiana. Start over." James shook his head. "Running won't change anything. They'll just find someone else to terrorize. Another family like the Morrisons. Another witness who might speak up. So what do you do?" "I keep telling the truth. I go to newspapers in St. Louis and Chicago. I tell them what happened here. I make sure the Morrisons aren't forgotten. That won't bring them back. No. But it might save the next family." Over the next weeks, James did exactly that. He gave testimony to abolitionist newspapers. He spoke at churches and town halls in free states. He told the story of Solomon Morrison's family and the trial that followed. The impact was slow but real. Abolitionist sentiment grew stronger. The case became a rallying cry for those fighting slavery and racial injustice. Luther Vance found his business dealings scrutinized by federal authorities. Nothing stuck, but the pressure was real. Sarah's boarding house did burn 6 months later. No one was inside. She'd sold it and moved to Illinois, where she continued her work helping escaped slaves. James never returned to Jefferson County. He settled in Ohio, bought a small farm, and spent the rest of his life teaching freed slaves to read and write. He died in 1873, an old man surrounded by people he'd helped. But on his deathbed, he asked his grandson to remember one thing. Truth doesn't always win in the moment. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes generations. But every person who speaks it, who refuses to be silenced, moves the world a little closer to justice. The Morrisons died because powerful men thought they could kill with impunity. I testified because someone needed to say that was wrong. The jury didn't convict, but the truth is still the truth. And truth has a way of outlasting lies. The grandson remembered. He wrote down James's story. And now you know it too. Because some stories need to be told, no matter how long they take to be heard.